Well, a lot of people on this channel haven't read Tower of God, but it's with this work that the channel really started, and it's still the work I've made the most videos about. So I imagine that it must have intrigued some, that others have tried to read it before stopping after a few chapters, saying that the drawings were ugly. Others have seen the anime and are waiting for a season 2, or found it boring, or still others who watched the videos anyway and got spoilers. In any case, Tower of God remains a bit of a niche work, I'd say, or at least it's a bit shunned by manga fans, a bit underrated. So in this spoiler-free video, I'm going to tell you why you should read Tower of God, and above all, why I personally think it's a wonderful work. And to put you back in context, Tower of God is a webcomic published weekly since 2010 by Slave in Utero, usually referred to as SIU, which is still ongoing with nearly 600 chapters and is available for free and legally in English on the Webtoon app, which will therefore be designed to be read on a smartphone with vertical scrolling and in color. At first glance, Tower of God isn't a very original story. We just follow a guy, Bam, who enters a tower to find a girl, Rachel, and who has to go through a series of trials to climb this tower, moving from one floor to the next, with a teasing final goal of reaching the top in order to have all his wishes granted. But it soon becomes clear that it's much more than that, and that this synopsis is really just the starting point for an infinitely more complex story set in an extremely vast universe. It's hard to talk about it without spoiling anything, so I'll have to give you a few basics that you learn a little vaguely in the first few chapters, but the Tower of God universe, its lore, is really very different from what you might expect based on the synopsis. The tower, for a start, is not some sort of JRPG dungeon to be finished off like that. The tower is a world of its own, a gigantic world at that, with at least 135 floors and a huge surface area on the order of a continent. Almost the entire story takes place inside the tower, to the point where everything outside the tower is completely unknown and constitutes one of the biggest mysteries in the whole story. And since the tower is a world in itself, it will also have a history with a capital H, unfolding over tens of thousands of years, which the author will develop little by little as the plot progresses. A story that leads logically to the tower's current political situation, itself quite complex and made up of numerous groups, antagonistic or not. To sum up the situation, the tower is run almost entirely by a kind of dictatorship, the Empire of Jihad, headed by a man named Jihad, who is more or less all-powerful, and by the 10 great families who are more or less devoted to him. There will be a group opposing this empire, called the Fug, whose ultimate goal will be to kill King Jihad and the heads of the 10 great families, and thus overthrow the empire. Another group called the Wolhaiksong will be fairly neutral, and their aim will simply be to find a way out of the tower into the outside world. Finally, there's a very mysterious group called the Workshop, which is the origin of just about all the technology in the tower, whose influence is almost greater than that of the empire itself, and who seem to hold many secrets concerning the tower, but who remain perfectly neutral, at least on the surface. And within these groups there are many factions, or even characters, more or less independent, with different goals, which can lead to internal conflicts, plots, betrayals and so on. In short, it's a mess that a whole host of characters will have to deal with. Added to all this, there's a rather complex combat system with a component called Shinsu, which is the equivalent of Nen in Hunter x Hunter or Chakra in Naruto, if you like, but also a whole strategic aspect in terms of teamwork, with organization according to precise positions, as well as a whole heap of varied weapons ranging from swords to snipers, not to mention weird stuff like a frog ring that reverses the entropy of a non-organic structure, or a bag that can compress and duplicate objects, that sort of thing. And on top of all that, you can add a whole bunch of creatures unique to this universe, who live in the specific environments of this universe, and can have a significant impact on it. I'm not going to detail all the lore of Tower of God here because it would be spoilerish, far too long, and above all because I've literally already done 22 videos in which I detail every notable part in the construction of this universe. Because yes, when I said it was a vast and complex universe, I wasn't lying. And on top of all that, the Tower of God universe has a real personality. Its author, SIU, makes numerous references to underwater vocabulary and aesthetics, giving this universe a certain recognizable singular touch. But the most interesting thing about this universe is the story that will unfold around it. As you can imagine, I can't really go into too much detail to avoid spoilers, but I think you've already more or less understood that, with such a complex universe, the story won't just be about a guy trying to find a girl by climbing the tower's floors bit by bit. The story is much more complex than that. Season 1 of the webtoon, which is really great by the way, is really just a long introduction to the real story of Tower of God. We soon realized that, while we almost always followed the point of view of Bam, the main character, In reality, the story of Tower of God is more like a huge chessboard on several levels, with characters fighting each other indirectly by manipulating other characters, while themselves being manipulated by even higher ranking characters, and so on. If you like stories with masterminds, guys who plan everything in advance by manipulating everyone and making complex plans, you'll get your money's worth. But apart from that, the story plays heavily on mystery, with mysteries that will really get you hooked if you're as sensitive as I am about that. The author plays superbly with our desire to know more, and has mastered this ability to partially answer our questions by bringing us even more questions to solve. And of course, the story is full of foreshadowing in every sense, and even recently, after more than 500 chapters, some of the boxes in the very first chapters are starting to make sense. All this is surrounded by a huge number of more or less parallel subplots, all of which seem to be more or less linked to each other, building up the main plot in the end. I just made a 30-minute video summarizing the whole mess, so that gives you an idea of how complex it is. But the story isn't just complex for the sake of being complex, with mysteries that are only there to keep us reading. If the story is complex, with a large number of characters, it's because it seeks to show us that reality itself is very complex, that there is no miracle solution to solve all problems, and that the world doesn't revolve completely around its main characters, that it continues to live without them, and even that they mainly undergo this world run by the powerful, without being able to change it too much, although they are gradually brought to have an increasingly important impact on the society in which they live, with a very shonen logic of rising power. As for the mystery, it's also going to make us ask a lot of questions, notably about the reliability of the narrator characters who tell us about elements of the lore, and who may very well be mistaken, lying to us, etc. And so to question the reliability of the narrator characters who tell us about elements of the lore, and so we're left wondering how the characters got access to this information, what they're sharing it for, how information is controlled more generally, and so on. A bit like One Piece, if you like, but more implicit and therefore more complicated to grasp. Ah yes, some call Tower of God the Korean One Piece, given its success in Korea and the scope of its plot, universe, foreshadowing, mysteries and so on. Which isn't necessarily relevant, I think, because the two don't have much to do with each other, only their scope is comparable in the extreme. But they're still two very different kind of work. Another thing I really like about the Tower of God story is that each arc is very different from the previous one, in terms of themes, construction, environments and so on. All the while remaining perfectly coherent with the webtoon universe, having a real narrative continuity and rarely giving that block narrative effect, where each arc would be a sort of independent story that we'd then link to a main plot with a few post-arc transition chapters. The arc-by-arc division is pretty clear-cut, but the arcs are far from independent of each other, and sometimes you really need to have a global vision of the plot to fully understand the implications of the arc you've just read. But for me, the main strength of Tower of God's story, apart from what I've just mentioned, is everything it tells us through different levels of reading. First of all, in terms of understanding the work, there are already several levels. As the story is based on foreshadowing, if you haven't been spoiled, your first reading will be very different from your second or even your third, because there's a whole host of things you won't understand at first, which will make a lot more sense once you've understood how the universe works, or just learned a few things. Certain dialogues will turn out to have a hidden meaning, certain scenes will be interpreted differently, and so on. And even as someone who knows the work very well, I'm not immune to rereading it in 10 years' time and seeing the first chapters in a different light. But when I talk about different reading levels, I'm talking above all about what SIU is trying to tell us through its story. Because of course it's perfectly possible to read and enjoy Tower of God as a kind of entertainment, without having to think too hard about it, or thinking only about the storyline, the mysteries, etc., in a somewhat superficial way. There's nothing wrong with that, and I think you'll be able to enjoy it like that in any case. But you can also scratch the surface a little more and ask yourself what the webtoon is trying to tell us. And then, a whole bunch of really interesting stuff comes to light. It's hard to explain without spoilers. And again, I've made videos on the subject, but there's bound to be a whole bunch of interesting reflections or themes that will be well dealt with. Like, I don't know, at some point there'll be a whole arc with an equivalent of ChatGPT, with the questions that arise from it, for example. The world of Tower of God is a fantasy world, but it's also a technologically advanced world, to the point where some passages are very sci-fi, so the diversity of themes covered is quite important. And this is another strong point of Tower of God's world building, which manages to make seemingly two different universes coherent, so that you can see guys fighting with swords or bare hands against armadas of spaceships without ever thinking that it doesn't make sense. But on yet another level, there's the fact that the whole construction of the Tower of God universe acts as a metaphor for South Korean society, and a little for North Korea as well, and for everything that's criticizable and profoundly wrong in these countries, or even, if we broaden it out a little, for any country ruled either by a totalitarian regime using the cult of personality, or by an ultra-capitalist political system based on the competition of all against all. Because yes, climbing the tower's floors to reach the top isn't just another satisfying trope for a video game vibe, where you've got numerical evolution and all. We'll soon realize that getting from one floor to the next is clearly the least of the plot's worries, in fact. No, here, climbing the tower by eliminating one's competitors is above all a way of highlighting the excesses of an ultra-competitive system that pushes individuals to the limit. The floors are really a tool designed to tell us how a society built in such an unhealthy way as that of the tower pushes the characters to behave in an unhealthy bad way. And that in the end, blaming people individually won't get us anywhere, because the fundamental problem comes from the environment in which they evolve, and that it's this environment that needs to be changed. In fact, you can already see the beginnings of all this thinking in Season 1. And even outside the world building of Tower of God, SIU will use the writing of these characters and their evolution in this same universe to convey certain messages to us, even if this is of course open to interpretation. For example, readers will be deliberately manipulated into hating a character who, in the final analysis, is much less detestable than many other characters who will themselves be almost admired, all in order to tell us about our biases of perception, how our judgment can be skewed by very superficial things, like the character's style, for example. Of course, we can add to all this a whole host of other qualities, from the quality of the character writing. I was able to make a 35-minute video on one of them, even though we know almost nothing about her, to the presence of an enormous number of stylish female characters, who play a real role in the story, perhaps even more so than the male characters overall, and with almost no fan service. The design ideas for the environments, creatures, different races and chara designs that will change very regularly, with each main character changing clothes or even haircuts several times in each arc, with real stylistic work, even if we're not talking about JoJo here either. Of course, we'll have some incredible battles that won't just be confrontations of power, in the sense that strategy will play an important role, where the different powers of the characters mean that a character weaker than another can win against a more powerful one, if he has specific abilities to which his enemy is sensitive, that sort of thing. Other battles will have a certain epic grandiosity that will always thrill the brawling shonen fan in me. And there's also something central to the Tower of God universe, the games. Throughout the story, the characters will have to play games of various kinds, sometimes with quite complex rules, in order to pass tests and move on to the next floor, or to settle a conflict or whatever, often putting strategy at the heart of the action, rather than combat. All of this is coherent with the universe, in the sense that it's the very rules of the tower that make these games possible, and ensure their coherence and arbitration, even when they involve superpowered characters for whom logic might lead us to believe that they wouldn't have to abide by the slightest rule. Humor too, it's rather anecdotal, but there are a few passages that made me laugh out loud, notably when SIU has fun breaking the fourth wall or making references to pop culture. In short, a whole bunch of little qualities that add up to the big overall qualities I've already mentioned. But if there's one thing to remember about Tower of God, it's its ambition. To my knowledge, Tower of God is one of the most ambitious works in comics, in terms of scope, size and complexity. We're dealing here with a very rich and complex universe, with a story that's just as complex, all with a scenario that's been planned for years and will continue for a long time to come. The kind of thing that's only supposed to happen in literature when it comes to individual works. Right now, we're almost 600 chapters in, and it's hard to imagine the story being even halfway through, so many plots still hinted at, mysteries still to be solved, or even floors still to be climbed. And I'm not going to talk about the Tulsa user story because that's going to take us a bit too far, and I've already made a video about it. In short, Tower of God is truly the work of a lifetime, a work that is still far from having shown all it has to show. Yes, Tower of God's story is a bit of a slow burn, in the sense that it's a story that takes its time setting up its plot and only gains in power as it goes along, constantly holding back from showing too much in order to save the best for key moments in the rest of the story, which makes it a work with immense potential. So why, despite everything I've said so far, is Tower of God so off-putting? Why does it remain a bit of a niche work? The first reason is its format and distribution. Many people are put off simply because it's a webtoon, because it's a model they're not used to. It's a bit sad because it's really just a matter of getting used to it. It can be confusing at first, but you get used to the format pretty quickly, and reading while scrolling on your phone is quite pleasant in the end, I think. As for the distribution itself, the chapters are all free on Webtoon, unless you want to read the last ones in advance. However, the big problem with Tower of God from a distribution point of view is the quality of its translation, which is really bad overall, despite a few passages that were very good. Between inconsistencies, names of specific terms that can change from one chapter to the next, spelling mistakes, and even some sentences with broken syntax. Everything suggests that the translation is being churned out by different people from one chapter to the next, who have no knowledge of the work in question. Sometimes you almost wonder if these guys speak Korean. And I'm not going to talk about certain passages that are completely sanitized or even censored, nor even about the translator's working conditions, which look disastrous. Fan translation isn't necessarily better, even if it has been for a long time, thanks to Adi. The consequences of this poor translation, aside from the fact that the chapters will be far less enjoyable to read, is that it will accentuate another of Tower of God's problems, the comprehension of the story. Indeed, as with any work of such complexity and scope, understanding all the ins and outs requires a certain investment, which not everyone has the time or inclination to make. Tower of God isn't just long, it's also dense with information, and sometimes seemingly insignificant little texts can actually be important to the story or overall understanding. Furthermore, SIU also relies on the intelligence of its readers, and implies a lot, or doesn't necessarily explain everything in black and white. Many elements are left deliberately vague, so if on top of that you add translation errors, and you only follow the story on a weekly basis without rereading it in one go from time to time, it can be complicated to understand everything and assimilate it properly. But it's precisely in order to overcome this problem that I've made these Tower of God videos, and I think, even if it's a bit pretentious, that thanks to them you can understand Tower of God in its entirety without having to invest a great deal of time and effort. Also, many people probably discovered Tower of God via the anime. Without going into too much detail, the anime is really bad in terms of adaptation. It's full of inconsistencies, the story is rushed, key scenes have been removed, SIU humor has been replaced by typical Japanese humor that makes no one laugh because it's been seen 100 times before. In short, if you discovered Tower of God via the anime and didn't get hooked, I'd advise you to try the webtoon, as it's much better. However, I can already hear some people telling me that, unlike the anime, the webtoon's drawings are very ugly. Well, yes, that's true, but it's only the case at the beginning. SIU improves quite quickly, and even allows itself a few great panels from time to time. And in his defense, it's worth pointing out that this was not only his first work as a professional, he also had to do everything himself: script, drawings, colorization, etc., all on a weekly schedule, and with rather long chapters, given that in the physical volume adaptation, a nearly 300-page volume contains 10 chapters. You already know how hard it is for mangakas to put out 20 pages in black and white every week with an army of assistants. So you can imagine that a guy like him, just starting out and having to do it all on his own, didn't necessarily have the time to apply himself. In the end, not only did he greatly improve, but he also started to have assistants little by little, which enabled him to take more time to take care of his drawings, and we ended up with drawings that were really good in the end. And finally, I think a lot of people are going to tell me that they don't read because they're lazy, or don't have the time because it's too long. And yes, that's true. It is long indeed, almost 600 chapters at present, with chapters that are sometimes very long, much longer than 20-page manga chapters in any case. But on the other hand, I think you can read Tower of God bit by bit, arc by arc, taking breaks, because in any case, since the work is still in progress and is likely to remain so for a long time to come, there's no hurry to catch up, so you can take your time. And I don't really think that length is a real break for most people. I mean, the best-selling manga of all time is literally over 100 volumes long. The length may seem daunting at first, but once you get into the story, you don't think about it, and wish there were more chapters once you're up to speed. Now, obviously it won't appeal to everyone, and I can't 100% guarantee that you'll love it, but I do think that many of the reservations people may have about Tower of God can be easily overcome, and that a lot of people miss out on a work they could love. To conclude on a purely personal appreciation, I've been reading Tower of God since 2013, attracted first of all by the originality of the universe and the plot, quite different from the shonen I was reading at the time while being close on certain points, and I read it for a long time without any real involvement. I thought it was very cool, but not a masterpiece either. But at a certain point, intrigued by certain somewhat obscure elements, I began to take a deeper interest in it, and that's when this work began to take on a whole new dimension. Tower of God presents one of the best crafted plots I've ever read, in any medium, in one of the best constructed universes I know. There are mysteries and foreshadowing everywhere, plenty of room for gigantic theories, the characters are incredible, and on top of all that, the story has a super interesting, well-delivered subtext. I sincerely believe that Tower of God is a major work of pop culture, and one of the most ambitious artistic projects of our time in terms of its scope. It's not a perfect work, and it's not necessarily made to please everyone, but it's a work that's very close to my heart, from a brilliant author who has dedicated his life to it, and which, in my eyes, deserves much more recognition. That's why you need to read Tower of God. Don't hesitate to like, comment, share the video with people who don't know Tower of God, They're the target audience after all, and subscribe of course and all that. If you're a bit lost and you're up to date, or almost, I suggest you watch my other videos on Tower of God, and I wish a good read to all those who are about to get started, hoping you like it. And as SIU has said over and over again, I don't know how many times in its end of chapter notes, be happy and healthy. Goodbye.